And Dr. Dan Stock is coming back up. He's going to give a talk about financial ties, hopefully stimulating, as always.
Thanks very much, Heather. I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Deborah Chisholm, who actually said, Dan, I think I'd rather hear your lecture than hear my own, and sacrifice the time to do this. If we could bring up the slides quickly. One of the things that's going to go up, you're going to see that credentials slide again. And there's a credential I have to do this lecture that you all don't know about, and that was back when it used to be you could be elected as a physician to the board of a hospital. I was elected by the physicians of the health network I worked at to serve on the board, and so I actually got to sit with all the business people and see all the money and how it moves from point A to point B and how the laws of all of this work. That's not up there, but everything that you're going to see here you actually can find in the Federal Register. It's all about as real as it can be. While we're looking to find that first slide here, I'm going to start off because I've got part of this memorized. The first things you should know about the medical marketplace is that the federal government doesn't pay its bills. So in every hospital and every doctor's office across the United States, Medicare and Medicaid reimburses providers less money than it costs them to provide the services they're providing. So in every hospital, remember that, every doctor's office, you're losing money on Medicare and Medicaid. Now you might ask yourself, well, why don't the hospitals just say we're not going to take Medicare and Medicaid patients? Well, there's a federal law that says you can't be a nonprofit hospital unless you accept Medicare and Medicaid patients and agree to take whatever the federal government will give you. In addition to that, there was a law passed called the EMTALA law, which says that if you have an emergency and you go to an emergency room, no hospital, whether it's a nonprofit or profit, is allowed to turn you away until they have stabilized your care. So because hospitals are also in most states not allowed to garnish wages or lien property for payment of a medical bill, effectively the EMTALA law declared that the value of emergency room services is $0. So if you're a hospital and you have an emergency room, you have to lose money on Medicare and Medicaid, you have to lose money on the emergency room. How do you make that up? And the way it's made up right now is by multiply overcharging everybody who has private insurance and cash pay. And that is to the tune of around 3 to 15 times the rate of what the actual cost of the service is. I will give you an example. If I write you an order for a complete blood cell count, you go down to your local laboratory that takes Medicare or Medicaid, you're probably going to generate a bill that's around $30. That's going to go to the federal government, who won't pay that much, but that's what the actual thing is going to be billed through. And if you're a cash pay person, or if you have, I should say, if you have a high deductible plan, you're going to pay $30 and that'll be applied to your deductible. Let's say you take back your insurance card and say, I tell you what, I'm going to pay you cash. The laboratory is allowed to give you a 20% discount. So now you're down to about what? $36. That very same complete blood cell count, I have a contract with that very same laboratory. They're going to do the blood specimen by the very same technician on the very same machine. It's $1.75. That's right. So, we ready for slides up there yet? So basically the way the system survives is by an incredible cost bilking of those people who are cash pay and have private insurance. Now this causes a terrible problem with cost shifting, all right? So the insurance budgets become more and more expensive. And as the cost of insurance goes up, hey, we're getting there, all right. We can go down to that healthcare market one there. It says that, you can get there. As that cost shifting goes up, we saw more and more people abandoning insurance. Employers would say, hey, we're not going to pay for insurance anymore. So the pool of people who can now offset the losses of Medicare and Medicaid becomes smaller, and the prices that we have to charge those people become greater and greater. So the employer started yelling at the people from the insurance companies and said, hey, you got to cut my costs down here. This is just going insane. And so the insurance companies began collectively bargaining against all the providers. And they would say, hey, you know what? We've got all the money from these patients through their premiums. We're just going to pay you this amount to do what you do as a doctor, this amount to do what you do as a hospital. And the only way to fight back in an open marketplace then was for the hospitals to employ the doctors. Because most states have laws that say if a group of doctors get together, well, that's actually an antitrust violation if we do it. So the doctors had to sell out to the hospitals. We started seeing them making large doctor groups that could negotiate, but most of them sold out to hospitals. And then came the tragedy of the Accountable Care Organization. So it was a little over 15 years ago, someone in your federal government had this great idea of what would be wonderful to improve the efficiency of healthcare. If all those independent providers who are out there doing whatever they thought was best for their individual patients just all became part of one great big organization that could share data, we would have more efficient healthcare. And so they went out and financially enforced this by telling all the independent providers, you guys are going to get paid 3% less than you're being paid right now for Medicare and Medicaid unless you join an ACO. But if you join an ACO, we're going to go ahead and give you 2% more because that's the improvement of efficiency we're going to get. So what doctors were practicing independently, when their reimbursements got cut further on Medicare and Medicaid, the only way to financially survive was to sell out to a hospital now. So if you can have the next slide there. So the problem was that when you look at ACOs, there were some strings that came attached. The first string was you had to have an electronic medical record system that would report aggregate data to the federal government and the insurance companies. Now, what these guys like to say is, well, I don't know if Dr. Stock just wrote a losartan prescription for a high blood pressure patient. I don't know who he wrote that for. But it does allow them to know that for any ACO that they're paying stuff to, we know what percentage of the doctor's high blood pressure patients got losartan. We know what percentage of them got an ACE inhibitor. We know what people who had COVID-19 got treated with ivermectin. That data is required to be collected and given to the federal government in aggregate data. But the federal government says, well, see, the ACO, that they know that information, but we don't. That doesn't give us federal power. Well, unfortunately, when you joined an ACO, there were some things that came from this. Doctors got to be called a cost center. That ACO knows exactly how many referrals you did and how much money they made from the referral, how many labs you ordered, how many medicines you prescribed. They know exactly how many MRIs you ordered, how many referrals you did. And they could actually now track to see whether or not you were making enough money to overcome the losses of Medicare and Medicaid and how profitable you were to the healthcare system. And the way they enforce to make sure you do this is by these restrictive non-compete, non-contact clauses that are in their contracts. So, for instance, if you go to my website at purehealthmed.com on the COVID-19 page, you're going to find my contract on there that I have with one of the local accountable care organizations. You'll notice the name of that is blocked out, so you can't tell what that organization is. And the reason it's blocked out is because there's a clause in the contract that requires me to deny having had a contract with that ACO. So not only are there non-compete, non-contact clauses, there are gag clauses and speak-well clauses that actually make it so that if this ACO, for any reason, decides to fire that provider, he has to move 10 to 50 miles away, depending on the ACO, stay away for 1 to 2 years. He's not allowed to tell his patients where he's going or why he's going there. He's not allowed even to advertise within that 10 to 50 mile radius for 1 to 2 years. So I can tell you that for doctors, our business capital, what we save up in the bank, is the faith that you guys have and your ability to trust and get our advice. And they can make it so you can't get our advice, which means basically you either have to go work for another ACO who will do the exact same things, or take the financial strain of starting up your own practice. They can bankrupt a doctor. And every doctor operates with that financial gun to his head all the time, along with his, next one please if I could, non-disclosure and speak-well clauses, that you're not allowed to even tell them that you have this contract with the ACO. And these ACOs actually control what a doctor can go learn. So the doctor is giving a continuing medical education budget, but the ACO has the right to tell him what classes he can spend that on. So we'll go to the next slide, please. The other thing you should, I forgot about the medical student loan forgiveness. Here's how nice your federal government is. Family doctor comes out of medical school about $350,000 in debt. And your federal government was kind enough to say that if he works for 10 years for a nonprofit like an ACO, we'll forgive that $350,000 in debt. But if you work 9 years, 11 months, and 29 days and get fired, you better get hired in 24 hours or you get all $350,000 of the debt back. It is not prorated. So that medical students now come out of their residency programs and immediately go to indentured servitude for 10 years. Next, please. And this is how you induce Stockholm Syndrome. For those of you who don't know what that was, there were actually some bank robbers took some hostages in Stockholm, Sweden, held them for about 6 days, I think it was, and so terrorized the people in this that when they were actually rescued, Many of them refused to testify against their captors and even empathized with them. Now imagine if you had that going on for 15 years, that you knew that your family could be financially devastated if you decided not to do what the ACO told you to do. Next slide, please. So how do the private employers get in this? Well, the first thing you know is private employers know little about the art and medicine, the art and science of medicine, right? Don't damn them for this. It's not what they're supposed to do. But they're required to participate in the system by the Affordable Care Act. They actually, if they don't buy you insurance, then they have to pay an enormous fine. And the other thing they know is that the federal government is the largest consumer, not only in the United States, but actually in the entire world, I read today. So if you have to sell products to, either as a subcontractor or directly selling something to the federal government, you're going to have to make sure that you're very good to your client. And so they eventually serve, and eventually they have trust in the federal government and the insurers, and serve the definition of good health care that the federal government and the insurers are happy to give them. And they are more than happy to do that. So let me show you how this thing is run on the federal government level. First thing you need to know about the Affordable Care Act is it actually transformed health insurance into a prepayment scheme for health care services. How does that work? Well, what they were told in the Affordable Care Act, if you want to be a health insurance company, you have to spend 80% of the money you take in premiums on health care activities. You can't give it as profit. You can't use it on administrative. Now, doesn't that sound nice to make that rule? Hey, Mr. Insurance Company, you have to spend 80% on those patients out there. But understand what that did if you want to maximize the profits of your insurance company. The way you make more money is you have to have more expenditures. You get 80, you can keep 20% of whatever gets spent. So the way you make more money is have more and more money get spent, but it has to be at the budgeted rate. After all, if we only spend 78%, we have to give 2% back to the people who gave premiums. If we spend 82%, that was 2% of profit that we just lost. And because of that, we actually made it so that good health is not profitable, but bad health is. And then they said, hey, we're going to have some rules about how we pay a doctor. Doctors get paid much better if they see 10 patients for 6 minutes than 1 patient for an hour. It's not even close. It's about 3 times greater. Now remember, you're a cost center for your accountable care organization. If you decide, boy, this gentleman just has a really complicated case, I'm going to need to sit down and think about this for a while to make sure I take care of all the things going on in this. Do you think that's going to be tolerated by your ACO? And you know that as a doctor? So it enforces superficial thought. As a matter of fact, I was speaking with one of the Indiana State Senators with a physician in attendance who actually indicated by his conversation and actually admitted he had not read the study that he was claiming Pfizer's vaccine showed prevented COVID-19 death. Had not read the study, all right? But why would you admit that? So then the Health and Human Services and the insurance companies come up with these pay-for-performance schemes. You know what? If you have 60% of your hypertensive patient on an ACE inhibitor or an ARB drug, we're going to give you a benefit. But if you have 59%, we're actually going to cut the reimbursement for that doctor. So every sore throat you see, if you aren't prescribing the right amount of ACE inhibitors and ARB drugs for your hypertension patients, you'll make less for every one of your sore throats. Now think about that when you're a doctor working in the cost center. All right, and every one of these ACOs knows it. Now the federal government says, we don't know what he's doing, but we don't need to enforce it. We'll just stop paying the ACO, and now the hospital CEO has to decide whether or not he's going to go bankrupt or fire the doctor. How many people think that works out very well for you as the patient? Do you think they fire the doctor? You've already heard some of the people come up here and said they were let go already, because some of the things they have guidelines for are like vaccine percentage, and not just of your patients, but of your employees. And these things are actually used to make the budget now in the insurance companies. We've got the guidelines. We went and got the group of experts we wanted to give us the guidelines. We don't really care what the guidelines are, but now we can plan the budget on that, although we kind of like the guidelines that spend more money. So the medical education then is forced upon the doctor through what's called board certification. And guys, I have a couple of board certifications. You know, it's nice to talk about. You need to know what a board is. A board is a group of doctors in particular specialty who got together and declared themselves to be geniuses. They are private organizations. They aren't elected. I don't get to vote for who's on the American Board of Family Practice. You don't either. They started off in the 70s, and most doctors never went and got a board certification. Because why would you get a board certification? It's mostly actually nothing but an advertisement that you go out to say to patients, see, I'm board certified, all right? It didn't really mean anything until about the late 1990s, early 2000s, when the insurance companies, as an attempt to collectively bargain back against doctors, said, you know, there's a lot of doctors who aren't board certified. We're going to pay them less. Now you're an ACO, and you have a doctor who's not board certified. He's not as profitable, so you go to the doctor and say, you have to maintain your board certification, or you don't get paid as much. And you know what the boards immediately did when that happened? You know what? We would get a lot more customers for our board certification programs, which, by the way, it's around $1,000 to take the course to prepare you for boards and around $1,500 to take the test for the boards. And now they said, we're not only going to make it so we have a certification program where every 5 years you have to get so many continuing medical education credits, but those have to be approved by the board in order to count towards your certification. And now the ACO says you can only spend your budget on those courses that will count towards your board certification. And they immediately changed the board courses, so they taught whatever the federal government and the insurance companies wanted taught. Now you have a doctor who can't think independently, and if he wants to go learn something, he has to go learn whatever you want him to go and learn. Next slide, please. And this is probably the most frightening thing you need to know about your healthcare system. The rules for billing the federal government and the insurance companies are incredibly nebulous. After all, you have to do things like, did you do an intermediate or a thorough physical exam on a patient? So these nebulous rules, every ACO knows that it's skirting the borderline of breaking and doing what we call unwilling noncompliance. The real problem with the system is not only are the rules nebulous, but the federal government is not the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Every hospital system knows that it's actually breaking the laws to a little degree all the time, and the federal government knows they're breaking the law to a degree all of the time. But they don't go out and take care of them unless they really want to. And when you have upset the federal government, then you will get sicked on by a contractor whose job is to go out and audit the ACO and find all of those things that are wrong, bring them to the federal government so that he can look at them for Medicare fraud and abuse. And you're now having a trial before the guy who's got the money in his hands. He's judge, jury, and executioner. You will be found guilty. And so you don't even have to be prosecuted now because you know that you have a fear of selective audit. If I am sideways with Health and Human Services, they can send out one of their auditor companies, who, by the way, gets to keep a percentage of all the money he gets back for you. And you should know how this works. They may review 2% of your charts, and if we found that you made a mistake on 2% of your charts, we assume you made a mistake on 2% of every single chart for that charge you did. Even though we don't review the other 98% of charts, they're allowed to assume you made the mistake and claw back an enormous amount of money from that ACO. So ACOs know that if they actually scare themselves into an audit situation, they can be financially destroyed. You people may have read about Community Health Network. They got an enormous one of these audits turned loose on them earlier this year or late last year. So then there are some regulatory problems about the industry itself. The first thing you need to know about, the FDA was given power by Congress to determine safe and effective. Now, is safe and effective the same for every single person? It's a very nebulous term, isn't it? But now they have a control over who can get to the market and who cannot get to the market. The biggest problem you have with that is actually if you look at the FDA's budget, and this is from their own website, 1/3 of all the money that pays salaries at the FDA comes from fines and fees that are collected from the patent, medicine, and device industry. Very little comes from the generic companies. The last I saw, to apply for an FDA new drug application, it was $100,000 to turn in the application. And then the FDA will tell you the study you have to do. Now, if the FDA doesn't like you, what they can do is tell you to do a study that they know will come out showing your drug doesn't work. And because there's no cooling off period for the FDA, CDC, NIH, most people who work at these organizations actually leave the NIH or the CDC or the FDA and go work for someone in private industry with a much better paying job because they have no cooling off period, usually lobbying them on how to take care of their friends who are behind at the FDA, who know that if this system works right, they will then get to have that job of vice president of paperclip accounting next that they get paid a very high salary to do. And then came the Bayh-Dole Act of 1984. So in 1984, federal Congress passed a law that actually changed patent law to make it so that if the federal government took your tax dollars and used it to pay for research that led to something patentable, whoever was paid to do the research could own the patent for their personal profit. Yeah, I heard that moan. So Dr. Fauci is not the only person at the CDC and the NIH who has patents on things like novel coronaviruses, genomes, the PCR tests, and to investigate these novel coronaviruses. But those patents are also shared with all of the universities that the CDC pays its research money out to do that. And of course, the doctor who's doing the research is an employee of that university, so the university actually owns the patent. And so what you've actually now done is you've made that the CDC, the NIH, and the universities are investors in patent disease treatment. So then as we said in the last lecture, we say, hey, vaccines, you're not allowed to sue these people for anything they do. That makes them a very low-risk investment, because now you don't even have to worry about being sued in the future for what you're doing. Next slide, please, or next click, please. And then comes the PrEP Act. The PrEP Act actually says that the NIH and the CDC can declare an emergency and start ruling by fiat. So they say things like, you know, if you're going to be on a plane, you have to wear a mask. I don't have to have Congress's permission to do this. I don't need your permission to do this. I just get to make this law. And most importantly, it authorized emergency use authorization, which means you can skip all of the safety and efficacy determination tools that were necessary to get these things to the market beforehand. Basically, you're allowed to end run the FDA. You're allowed to take the FDA, and all of the regulations they have can be gotten around. So, what is the vulnerability that comes from this concentrated power? Well, first of all, the NIH, CDC, Human Health and Services become very worthy investments for lobbying. So what you do is you start saying, hey, Senator, if you'll support my putting this person in this position, you get campaign cash. And now you get a group of people who are not being selected because they have a great understanding of science, scientific acumen, and its compassionate use to improve the human condition, but rather because their personal foibles are profitable. Vladimir Lenin used to refer to this as the useful idiots. So now you have a government that's actually captured by the very industry that it's supposed to regulate. And now it's pretty easy to see what happens after that. The vaccine industry starts to grow, more new vaccines coming out every year for pathogens that really don't even cause a problem. Research begins on novel patentable pathogens. And by the way, the chance this is naturally occurring is about the same as the chance that I'm going to be starting at center for the Pittsburgh Penguins. And I've seen Sidney Crosby play hockey. All right? Next thing you know, we have escape of some gain-of-function pathogen from some research lab. The NIH and the CDC declares an emergency with their very self-serving recommendations because they are, in fact, invested in this. The Health and Human Services financially enforces this by coming out with protocols that say, hey, hospital, we're not going to pay you to test a person who's been vaccinated for COVID-19, but we'll pay you to test the unvaccinated, and asymmetric data collection begins to achieve so that you can actually prove things that you don't really want to prove. And then Congress grants the NIH and the CDC the power to actually fund this, to promise these drug makers of patent products that we will buy this stuff as long as you can get through the FDA, who we've already given permission to actually loosen up all the rules to prove whether or not this works or doesn't work. And then all you have to do is watch back and watch the FDA say, hey, you know what, generic repurposed products, to get our approval that would allow them so that they could be part of the protocols, well, that's cost prohibitive to do. And all I have to have is NIH that says, hey, look, FDA says that ivermectin is not supposed to be used for COVID-19, and by the way, we can track that through the electronic medical record that, hey, ACO, you have a bunch of doctors who are using ivermectin for COVID-19, and you'll rapidly see the ACO do exactly what it has to do to financially survive, come out and tell that doctor you're going to get fired. I wish you all could know the name of Dr. Peter McCulloch, who was one of the guys who first started doing this, and Baylor fired him, despite the fact he was saving lives. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the financial explanation for why your doctor tells you to take a vaccine that he's read very little about and knows very little about. This is why your doctor is not going to your legislator and saying, hey, we have a problem here, Houston. And the best example I can say, I don't know if you guys know that there was a video that I did in front of a school board that got a little popular on the internet. But let me tell you what my volunteers who helped me get through all of the incoming information we got in emails and voicemails. We had 2 physician providers who called up, text, or emailed to say anything negative about what was said at that school board meeting. We had over 1,000 who called up who said the exact same thing. Thank you for speaking out. We would, but we're scared. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, I have the names of physicians who have asked me to say, Dr. Staff, we'd like to be involved in this, but can we do it in a way that we don't have our names used? So, ladies and gentlemen, I will encourage you to speak with all of your legislatures. At the federal level, it probably won't work. It's for sale. But mostly at the state level, because we can do things with laws to free doctors up from this hegemony they have on them and make them so they can again serve you as they would like to serve you in their unfrightened fashion. Thank you.